Hey, everybody, and welcome back to DejaVue.
It's your favorite Vue podcast. You just don't know it yet. I'm here with Alex.
Hey, everybody, what's going on? I'm Alexander Lichter. I'm a web engineering consultant, part of the Nuxt team, and also do a little bit of content here on YouTube and Twitch about Vue, Nuxt, and JavaScript and frontend. And super curious to talk today with Michael Thiessen. How are you doing, Michael?
I'm doing pretty good. And for those of you who don't know, I do Vue content creation and all of that good stuff. Today, we're going to talk to you about signals. So our last episode was on reactivity in Vue. And this one, we're going to go a little bit broader and talk about signals and how that relates to Vue and web development and all of that.
As we mentioned, right? We mentioned we're going to do a singles episode, and here we are. So maybe to start with signals in that way. Like, I think it's some kind of a hype word has been around. We come to how this looks like in the general web landscape, as you said. But before that, maybe you should start with what signals are and a bit of history, let's say, because the concept is not as new as the hype suggests.
Yeah, I think that's true for a lot of things, that there's always like this hype cycle, things come and go. It's trendy now, but it was trendy 10 years ago. And, we go through this cycle all the time. But reactivity and signals are very much linked. In fact, when I first was seeing this hype around signals, I was like, I don't really know what this is. I started to dig into it and I thought, wait, isn't that just reactivity in Vue? Like what's all this hype about? And I would say that the simple answer is, yeah, it's basically the same thing. The idea of, instead of having to explicitly update state and then do something with that new updated state, signals let us write in a reactive way. And it's hard to describe signals without using the word reactive, because I think for me at least, that's the way that I understand it the best. But this idea is actually pretty old. It comes, I think, even in the 80s or 90s when it started, is called reactive functional programming. So started with a bunch of researchers trying to figure out better ways of building software. So they came up with this system that uses functional programming languages like Haskell, or pick your favorite functional language, and added on this idea of reactivity. Now they did this because UIs, as we all know, it's usually we are reacting to things that are happening around us. It's different than lots of other software, like, I don't know, embedded systems and so on. But we're dealing with lots of reactive events. The user clicks on something, they turn a dial, they, something like that, and we want to react to that input. So they came up with this way of basically describing the relationship between an input or an event and how that changes a variable over time. And so instead of writing all of this code that says, like have an event handler and then, we got to update this thing. And then instead of writing that all out in an imperative way, we get this more declarative, this value here is directly tied to the position of the mouse. And we can just say we don't even have to say when the mouse position update this value. We can just say, this value is equal to the position of the mouse. And it does some fancy stuff underneath the hood, and it all works together very much in the same way that we're used to with writing Vue.
So that means, when we remember about the reactivity episode, we talked about that there is no reactivity natively in JavaScript. And with signals, that might come to language, which we'll discuss in a bit. But that really sounds like a uniform way, let's say, to describe reactivity in a certain language, or like as we have in a framework. But why does the whole hype come up now? Do you have any idea why it certainly caused some traction, and maybe some frameworks who like use signals a lot? Why now?
Yeah, so I was looking at the history of this, and I don't know if there exactly what caused this shift into web development, but I know if you're familiar with the RxJS library that has this idea of observables.
Mhm.
I believe that started in Java for building applications, and then eventually that became a JavaScript library. But there were along the way, there were different frameworks and libraries that started to use this. I think Knockout was maybe one of the first ones that had this signals based idea, or reactivity, or however, I'm not sure what term they were using for that.
I think like fine-grained reactivity or fine-grained signals, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've never actually used Knockout.js myself,
Ah,
so
me
I'm
neither.
not that familiar with it. But then I do remember that around the same time that React came out, I guess, and was starting to gain all this popularity, there was another framework called Elm, which basically was this reactive functional programming idea, but applied to web applications. And it compiled to JavaScript, and you could use JavaScript libraries with it. But it was harder. It's harder to use. It's still around. I don't know how actively it's being worked on, but it
I've seen it
didn't.
every now and then mentioned for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it was a functional language. It was based on Haskell, if I'm correct with that. And I would guess that the reason it didn't gain as much popularity is because, first of all, Haskell is a little bit harder to understand. It's like very functional and a little bit harder to wrap your head around because of that.
It's like a very different concept, like functional programming in general. Like
Yeah,
once you get started with it, it's lots of fun though. Like as soon as clicks, it's you wonder maybe why ever doing OOP or something
yeah,
like that.
it's a lot of fun. It forces you to think about the problems you're solving in a completely different way. So if you've never tried functional programming, I would suggest it just as like a fun thing. There's like Lisp, or a whole host of these different
OCaml
functional language.
should be really fun. I heard, yeah.
Yeah,
Or
OCaml.
for like what I tried, I really liked, which is also a bit more web developer centric, let's say, but not only is Elixir.
Okay, yeah,
Based on like the Erlang VM, and like Elixir is a proper functional programming languages, also like immutable type systems, super fast, super reliable. So can highly recommend to give it a try.
yeah. And there are a lot of applications built with these things, but they're just like more specialized in some ways. So my guess would be Elm didn't get popular because of, one, it's functional and people are less comfortable with that, and two, it's strongly typed. And I think so, like TypeScript would be, it's got like this type system, and I think it was before type systems were really like mainstream and people were comfortable with that, and so
At
it
least in
was
web
these.
development.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, in web development specifically. And so I think those two things sort of made it like, well, with JavaScript, you can just like start writing stuff and like hack things together. But with Elm, you had to really think through, okay, if I'm doing it functionally, I gotta like think about it in this way. Oh, but then I also have to figure out the types that I'm using. And you can't just like throw an any on there like you can with TypeScript. So you have to like really think through this stuff. And so it's more of a challenge to like get this hello world or a to-do list app built. But for me at least, that was a major point along this signals journey. I don't know how much Elm inspired things that came after it, but that's something that I remember playing around with at that time.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And another point of the functional part is the whole like side effects part. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
everything should be pure ideally, and then you have some like impure parts. And I really like the pattern, but it can be really tedious to work with, especially in web development, where ideally, sure, you would have everything strongly typed, but well,
Mm-hmm.
how often we used any in TypeScript? How often back in JavaScript we had nothing, and still worked in a way. And sometimes you also simply don't know, right? Like where we have like Zod and Valibot right now for parsing, we could just tell TypeScript, hey, this is that. we'll never know because it's like an API response. We can't possibly foresee what actual the type will be. We need some runtime validation if we really want to make sure. But of course, these problems are solved in a way, but I think it's way more to use to get into the concepts than just saying, okay, I just write that or write an any, and that's fine. So I think the functional programming adaptation, especially for like front-end development, is really comes down to convenience to a certain degree.
Yeah, and I think there's already so much knowledge and like other packages and things that are built in a different way that it's harder to, like, I feel like these things have to evolve slowly over time. Like we have TypeScript now, which is sort of like an evolution of JavaScript. It's not an entirely different thing. And so I think that makes a big difference.
Definitely. And well, now we slowly come from the part of its history to moving towards the present. So what's the next stop on the signal history?
Well, I think chronologically, Vue was one of the first of these more modern frameworks to use a reactivity system. And then after that come Svelte and Solid, which we're more familiar with today. They're still around. They're still being worked on, and people are using them. And I think it's funny to me because like this whole conversation around signals, it seems at least at the beginning, seemed to leave out the fact that Vue had this, and then it was like, oh, it's this new thing, and then here I am thinking, but wait, is it new?
Maybe that's a good point to get into details, like just explaining for our listeners and audience in general, like how signals look like in most other frameworks except Vue, and how to look in Vue to maybe more understand why it's less obvious for people. So commonly, for example, Solid.js, if you hear signals nowadays, you usually think of like Ryan Carniato, someone who's very, very performance focused. I feel like I mentioned this in the Evan U episode already, and he really pushed signals forward. Also in the matter of general availability with proposal, which we'll come to in a bit. And so the idea is you can have a function that's just called, let's say, create signal, and you can give in a default value for that signal. So let's say you have a simple counter and say create signal 0. And what the return will be, that depends a bit from framework to framework, but usually you have two things. You have like a getter and a setter. So you have one method that just gives you back the count. So you can invoke that count function and you get back exactly that, pure count. And then you have a set count function, which basically you can invoke. And in there you define your own function and say, okay, get the previous value and do something with the previous value, like the value plus 1, or just set it to a certain new value. And as soon as you invoke set count, then the value of count will actually update because, yeah, we have signals, we have reactivity, so that will change. And for everybody thinking like, wait, this sounds like a more complicated way to describe what we have with ref right now, just without the functions. Exactly. That's the thing. Like in Solid, in Preact, in Svelte with runes, it's also a little bit different. But in Angular, also having signals, we all have these concept of a getter function, a setter function. It's slightly different here and there, but we don't have them in Vue at all. We just say like, okay, we have a ref and then we're good. We could build own signals in Vue. I actually also did it in one of the videos, which is also linked below, with the help of shadow ref, because commonly signals are not deeply reactive. They're just reactive in top level. You have that setter function, and wherever that setter is invoked, the thing will update, which means you always replace the value. With refs in Vue, you don't have that. You have the whole like deeply nested reactivity. You can also do this technically with signals by nesting them, but that's also a whole other story and depends a bit on framework to framework. But that's also more or less the reason why they're not that big of a hype word in Vue, because we have implicit signals, right? We don't have them explicitly. Yeah. They're just there.
Instead of calling these functions, oh, I'm going to get the value for this. Oh, I'm going to set the value. We just get the value when we set the value. It's more like it's invisible. Like there's this sort of like, we don't have to think about it as much because it just happens. And I think that's, some people might view that as a bad thing because they want these extra things to be explicit and like, oh, okay, you are using signals in this part of the code. I understand that. Whereas with Vue, it's like, okay, you know it's a Vue application, so you know that there's reactivity there. And that's why you know that you can do dot value equals this and it'll just update. Or if it's reactive, you can just update the properties as you want.
Exactly. I think one of the strengths of signals, and that's why it's usually compared to ref as well, is that you can pass the signal around in a way, right? You can pass the getter further, only the getter, for example, or only the setter. With refs, you can't really do that. You can't really say, okay, I pass the getter and the setter around. You could have computed with a getter and a setter, and then you might have a chance. But even there, like separating that is a little bit more effort. Which means, okay, sure, you can expose the ref as read-only and then a method updating the ref. So you find your way around it. But with signals, as you said, they're a bit more explicit and also what you can share with other components and whatnot. So in signals, it's separated by default. With Vue's refs, you have to do it on your own if you really need to. But I also don't think it's inconvenient. This is actually the opposite. I think that level of abstraction and developer experience saves a lot of nerves, at least for me.
So like what kind of benefits would we get from being able to pass just the getter or just the setter? You'd mentioned like a read-only thing. You could pass in just the getter to some other function and all it can do then is get the value.
Exactly. But and not like write on it. Yeah. So more of a separation of like of capabilities. That component can only read the value and not change it.
Yeah. Okay. But I guess in Vue we have a read-only utility that helps us do that. And I guess would there be value
only
for
downside,
a write-only?
Well, I don't think we have write-only. Then probably you would have just a function that's like, I don't know, let's say user is a ref and you pass down the ref as read-only user. And then you can have set user, which takes any value that just does user.value is equals to the new value.
Yeah.
That's commonly how I abstract it in some composables way, because I don't want people to like mutate the user directly, because maybe I want to have a watcher on that as well that does something, or like I have some other side effects where I shouldn't just do it directly. And the logic into mutating that part should also be part of the composable and not just like scattered around the application, just to have a bit more capsulation there. Yeah, so in the end, I would say like that's probably why nobody in the Vue community is like hyped around signals in a way, because we have them already. They are included in the framework, in the reactivity system that you, as we said in the last episode, also can use anywhere in your own applications that are not Vue as well. So I think one last point to touch on could be pretty interesting is that signals will eventually become part of the ECMAScript standard, which mean they will hopefully be part of the language at some point.
Yeah, there's this TC39 proposal for them, and it looks very similar to like what we were discussing with the get method, the set method. It's less magical, which would make sense because, yeah, it's less like what Vue has, where we just update things. And I think that makes a lot of sense because it's an addition to the language. Not everyone's going to want to use reactivity or have it be reactive by default. And so it's like more of an opt-in as opposed to just like a default thing. And so I think that makes a lot of sense. I haven't dug into this proposal quite a lot yet, but I mean, it's there if you want to check it out.
Yeah, it's definitely worth taking a look at that and seeing how it is in a way similar. You have like still computed things and signals, which make sense, things depending on other things. We have effects, all with which we talked in the reactivity episode. And it's also very nice to see that people from the different, let's say, bubbles, the different ecosystems worked on it. Like people of major frameworks, not only, for example, Ryan mentioned before, who's reading to signals, but also, of course, Evan took a look at it as well. Eduardo is listed in the contributors, for example, for the proposal. And there are quite some people having eyes on it, weighing in and discussing what's in the end fits all needs in the JavaScript ecosystem, but also doesn't benefit a certain framework over it. So more or less the best of both worlds, or all worlds even.
Yeah, and I like that this idea of having it baked into browsers and like a common system that all these different libraries can use, because to me, it seems pretty clear that using signals or reactivity is like the right way to build UIs. And it's interesting to think about web development and I guess UI development too, as like in terms of the history of software development. And it's fairly new. And we're still, in a way, trying to figure out how to use JavaScript, how to build web apps. And to me, this is something that is like, okay, components, that's something that we like, we'll keep that. And signals is also like one of those core things that I don't know, moving forward, I don't see a world where we stop building applications with signals or suddenly decide that it's a bad idea. Maybe there's like an evolution or like a new version of it that we'll see 10 years from now. I don't know. But it
Yeah,
seems like, oh, like the last 10 years ish, we've like really been figuring this out and it works great and it's here to stay.
yeah. I also think like signals won't go anywhere as soon as they are standardized, because it's important to mention that the proposal right now is, I think, at stage 1. I think it moved to stage 2 at some point, but if I see the repository correctly here, it is still stage 1. So it might take a little bit to actually make that standard into the language. But in a way, it's also good because you don't want to break the web. You can't change what's in there, and then having a signals 2 would be like it would be a bit tricky. So like it's fine that frameworks have their own implementations, and that the general the general implementations for everyone, that might take some time. And it's great that people pioneered that work, like from Knockout earlier on, as we discussed, and now all the frameworks using it. And eventually we get quite some benefits, but probably for you, dear listener, dear person in front of the screen or driving a car, listening to the podcast or whatever, you probably will not use a lot of the native signals. Let's say if you work with Vue.js like directly, you will probably not say like new signal.computed. You don't have to learn a new reactivity API. The idea is that Vue and all the other frameworks, they will use signals under the hood with the goal to benefit on their memory usage, on their design, and in the end get more performance thanks to that. But there's also one more thing. We talked about Vue use in a few episodes ago, or quite a few, but still. And we talked about it. Vue use is working as composable, right? We have like all the composables in Vue use, they are based on reactivity. And what if we could make Vue use, but for all the people, for all the frameworks, because they all use signals. And Vue use would be based on signals. And then you have like your Vue composable, and then your solid signal for that, or your Angular signal, Preact, Quick, whatever. So having a way for a global framework utility library that just works with all frameworks, if you have that little bit of integration, that would be pretty sweet, no?
That's the most interesting part of this for me, is that the potential for that collaboration between the different frameworks. And like it seems like there are fewer and fewer places where we can have framework agnostic packages, like, you know, a fetch library, okay, or validating user input, okay, but even then it's like, okay, it's like tied to the specific framework in a lot of ways. But then with the signals thing, you could then write reactive composables that are framework agnostic. And if you want to switch between different frameworks, that's a lot easier in the future. And yeah, a Vue use library that's just like signals use library. I don't know.
Could be fun. And I also think like, even though you have probably a little bit of integration work to do with the frameworks, it's way less effort than rewriting that like we have it now. We have like React hooks, like a library for that. We have our Vue use, and probably the same things exist for all the other the other frameworks, or will. So yeah, we can dedicate time for something more meaningful once again than like reinventing the wheel, while we could all just collaborating at the same thing. I'm really curious for that. And yeah, I think these are the most important parts. Also, why it's probably not that relevant for a framework developer to know like the Signals API inside out. It still will be really fun to use when you have vanilla JavaScript and write your to-do list, for example, because then you can actually get rid of lots of imperative code and just like, okay, if there is something changing, then please set that new value as like inner text or in HTML. and you're good. That's also what's in the proposal as like an example where you can see even totally vanilla to just create a counter will be a bit easier than just all that manual DOM API work.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to it. And in the meantime, we can just keep using Vue and get that reactivity and enjoy using it.
Exactly. And if you're also enjoying Vue and maybe would meet a few like-minded people, go to a very awesome conference, then the Vue.JS DE conference, so the conference in Germany for Vue.js in Bonn this year in early October is right around the corner. So if you want to, there's a discount code. It's pretty simple. It's just DejaVue for some tickets. I'll be there. Some other people from the episodes, like Daniel, for example, will be there. There's live Q&A with Evan. It would be lovely to meet you all there. So definitely have a look. And if you're interested, then snag your nice discount and join a conference.
And if you want to keep listening or watching some Vue and Nuxt content that we've got a bunch of great past episodes you can check out. So do that wherever you're listening to this right now. Subscribe. That also helps us out. And we'll catch you in the next one.
Exactly. See you soon, folks.